Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a new website, then get your domain name and web hosting through Bluehost. Bluehost is easy to use, has great customer support, and easily integrates with WordPress, Google Workspace, and numerous other online tools. Plus, if you get your hosting at my link, then you could potentially get your site promoted via this podcast. Get your hosting through Bluehost at placesandprofiles.com/blue. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today I'm speaking with Jeevan Vasagar about key events in the historical and cultural development of Singapore, how Singapore became so successful economically, and some of the issues and challenges faced by modern Singapore. Jeevan is climate editor at Tortoise Media. Before that, he was a foreign correspondent for the Financial Times in Singapore and Berlin, and a staff reporter at The Guardian, including spells as East Africa correspondent and education editor. He is the author of Lion City, Singapore, and the Invention of Modern Asia. You can follow him on Twitter at Jeevan Vasagar. That's at Jeevan Vasagar. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at placesandprofiles.com/11. Jeevan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Adam.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I greatly appreciate it. So let's start out with your interest in and your connection to Singapore, because obviously to write a book about a particular location or a particular topic, that takes a lot of time. It takes some research. It takes some commitment. So why Singapore? What connection do you have to Singapore, and why were you interested enough in Singapore to write this book?
So, Adam, I now work for a company called Tortoise Media in London, and I'm climate editor there. But back in 2015, I was Berlin correspondent for the Financial Times, covering politics and economics in Germany. And at the end of that year, the FT offered me the chance to move to Singapore. And I had an existing family connection to Singapore. So I knew that my dad had grown up there. And we'd gone back there pretty often as kids, gone to visit family in Singapore and in Malaysia. So I was pretty interested in taking up this job. I moved there in 2016. So I should say a word about my dad, who was born in Ceylon, as it then was. It's now called Sri Lanka, the island just off the tip of India. But when he was a boy, he stowed away on a ship that sailed east across the Bay of Bengal. And landed in Singapore. And he made his own way in Singapore, became a policeman. After he died, I found a picture of him dressed as a policeman in the Singapore policeman's uniform of colonial times. He moved to Britain in the 60s, and I was born in Britain and grew up in the UK. But I always knew that he had a Singapore connection. So that was part of my enthusiasm for moving to Singapore, living in Singapore, was that my dad had grown up there. When I moved to Singapore for the first month, I absolutely loved it. It was an experience of living in Asia. Singapore has an ethnic Chinese majority, but a really substantial Tamil-speaking minority. And my home language when I was growing up as a kid was Tamil. And so a lot of the street signs, announcements on the metro were in Tamil, were familiar to me. So it was kind of like a feeling of sort of homecoming almost. Obviously the weather was balmy and people were very friendly. Everything worked. It was an incredibly slick, efficient, modern place. And then at the end of my first month there, I began to have a sort of slight feeling of discomfort. And the discomfort arose whenever I talked to people about politics, whenever I discussed something that was slightly challenging about the government in Singapore. And I found that people were often uncomfortable to get into the subject, uncomfortable to engage with controversy, would often freeze up, go quiet when there was discussion turned to anything critical of the government. There were obviously exceptions to that, particularly among people who'd been educated abroad and were quite happy to engage in debate. But I noticed quite often there was that edge to conversation. And increasingly, as I lived there, I found there was a tension between the appearance of Singapore, the sense that this is this beautiful, efficient, green place to live with a really high standard of living, really high standard of material comfort, and yet also the feeling that there was something unspoken, things that couldn't be said, things that people were afraid even to think, and particularly centering on any kind of questioning of the government. And it was out of that tension that my book Lion City came.
Yeah, and we'll return to the topic of modern Singapore and that tension here momentarily. But just to put all of this into the proper context, let's go back before Singapore was independent. Stamford Raffles is largely associated with the founding of what we now think of as Singapore. And then Singapore was a part of the Straits Settlement. It was a British colony for decades. What exactly happened during that time period, and how did that period of Raffles founding the city and then British rule as part of the Straits Settlement helped shape Singapore into what we see today?
So there was a thriving mercantile centre in Singapore in the 14th century when it was known as Temasek. It was a centre of trade. But the story of modern Singapore really begins in colonial times, and it begins, as you say, with Stamford Raffles. Raffles was a British colonial administrator. He had his eye on Singapore as a place where the British could do trade as a fulcrum between India and China, and as a place where the British could challenge their rivals, the Dutch, essentially. So his vision of Singapore was as a free port, a place where traders of all nations could come and do business. And in the early years, it did thrive just as he predicted. So its location was extremely convenient. British military power provided security when pirates were a threat in the region, but the British were able to deter them. And a significant number of Chinese and Indian merchants came to settle in Singapore and do business there. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the period when Raffles was in charge in Singapore is that there were conflicting visions of what kind of place Singapore should be between Raffles and a man called William Farquhar, who was put in charge of the colony when Raffles was away. And Farquhar's vision of Singapore was much more pragmatic. So Raffles was an opponent of gambling. He frowned on drugs. Farquhar tolerated slavery in Singapore, and he auctioned the rights to run gambling dens and to sell arak, which is a spirit that's popular in India. So he had a really different view of the city from Raffles' more puritanical, you might say, view. And that conflict has sort of played itself out in modern Singapore. So if you go to Singapore today, it's one of the few post-colonial nations in the world where its colonial heritage is pretty openly embraced and celebrated. I mean, Singapore obviously speaks English. They use the English legal system. But there's also a statue of Raffles in a prominent location in the centre of Singapore. And Raffles is recognised by the government as someone who was a pioneer of early Singapore. Raffles' opposition to gambling and also his vision of Singapore as a centre of trade is still there in modern-day Singapore. But there's also an element of Farquhar's pragmatism. So Singapore now does allow casinos, for example, having opposed gambling for years. So there's that conflict between the need to make money and a sort of slightly more high-minded vision is there in modern Singapore.
So, we fast forward through Singaporean history, and we move to the part where it is no longer a part of a British colony. It's no longer a part of the Straits Settlements, where Malaysia has become an independent country, and Singapore is initially a part of Malaysia. What happens during that time period, and how do efforts during colonization in Singapore lead to this situation where Singapore is in this precarious, I guess we could say, situation of being joined to Malaysia for a brief period of time?
So both Singapore and Malaya had been British colonies, part of the British Empire. Singapore's right at the southern tip of Malaya, the Malayan Peninsula. And it was the place through which Malayan commodities like tin and rubber were exported to the world. And it was also the place through which labourers came to work in those tin mines and on those rubber plantations. When pressure for independence arose both in Malaya and Singapore, there was a faction in Singapore who favoured a merger with Malaya. They felt this would create a common market, provide additional resources to help drive economic growth. I'm going to mention a man who becomes really significant in Singapore's story, and that's Lee Kuan Yew, who was Singapore's founding prime minister. He was a British-educated lawyer who was one of those who led the struggle for independence in Singapore. And he was one of those who favoured the merger with Malaya. So Singapore and Malaya end up in a union. Now, the two countries are, in some respects, very similar, but there's a significant difference in their ethnic balance. So Singapore is majority ethnic Chinese, about 3/4 ethnic Chinese. Malaya itself is majority Malay, although it has a really substantial Chinese minority.
How does Singapore end up disentangling itself from this, from being joined to Malaysia? What brings about Singaporean independence? What are some of the tensions that lead to that?
So there's a substantial ideological difference between the leadership of the two parts of this country, the leadership of Malaya and the leadership of Singapore. In Malaya, there was a belief that affirmative action was needed to promote the cause of the Malay majority, who were some of the poorest people in the country, while some of the wealthiest people in the country were Chinese businessmen. And there was felt to be a need to level up the Malay population. In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew and the men around him were unwilling to concede special racial privileges. And Lee said that resisting Malay hegemony, as he put it, was the sort of root cause of the dispute between the two countries. And on the Malay side, some people accused Lee and his party, the People's Action Party in Singapore, of mistreating Malays in Singapore. And there was a moment of when these tensions erupted into the open in 1964, when there was rioting that broke out between Malays and Chinese in Singapore. And there were two waves of riots that year, in which more than 30 people died. And this was a really shocking event for Singaporeans, because the island had been a place where every race just got along together really well. So the political arrangement holding the two territories together had been really damaged by the riots. Lee was also campaigning publicly against affirmative action, talking about the need for economic development that he said would lift the cause of all the races. And behind the scenes, there was negotiation between Singapore's finance minister and the Malaysian leadership. And there were basically talks that in which both sides agreed that a complete secession was the only way out for Singapore. And in the August of 1965, Malaysia expelled Singapore from the Federation, and that was the public version of events, that Malaysia threw Singapore out. Lee was sort of publicly distraught at this turn of events. But there were a number of people in Singapore who had quietly worked for this outcome and were glad that this had happened, that Singapore was going to go it alone.
Now, in the present day, we think of Singapore as being this modern city, an economic powerhouse, global center of trade. But when we look at the 1960s, and as this was going on with Singapore separating itself or being expelled, depending on the perspective, from Malaysia and becoming an independent country, that wasn't necessarily the case. So how would you describe Singapore's economy and life in Singapore as of 1965, when Singapore became an independent country?
So if you go back to 1965, the Singapore you would have seen then is very different to Singapore today. So today it's a city of glass and steel, a city of high-rise office towers, of high-rise housing blocks. Then it was a much more low-rise city, so you would have seen grey stains on the walls from cooking fires, traditional shop houses where there were shops at the front and living quarters at the back, street traders pushing food carts through the streets and hawking their goods in a variety of Asian languages, and a trading settlement at the centre, and then a sort of sprawl of shanty towns around it. Singapore's economy was transformed in the 1960s and 1970s, and there were a number of kind of key elements to that transformation. The starting point of the shift was an emphasis really on clean and efficient governance. Governance that was highly coordinated between the ruling party, Lee's party, and the civil service. And also zero tolerance of corruption. So Singapore became known as a place where there was a really efficient bureaucracy, a really efficient government, and also one that was very clean, where you wouldn't have to pay bribes. The other kind of key element in Singapore's economic success was instead of focusing on what was called import substitution, so producing goods to replace foreign imports, Singapore turned outwards to the world and focused on producing goods for exports. And one of these goods, for example, was semiconductors. So semiconductor assembly was an industry that was set up in Singapore, and it became part of a network of Asian economies that were involved in the semiconductor supply chain, including Taiwan. So the focus throughout this period in the 1960s and 70s was on export-led growth. And there was a focus from government on pushing Singapore effectively up the value chain, developing industries that needed high skills, and building an education system to match.
Now, you've mentioned a few times Lee Kuan Yew, and you've also made reference to the People's Action Party, which has been the ruling party in Singapore going back to it achieving its independence, and even a little bit before then as well. What are some of the key characteristics that listeners should know about Lee Kuan Yew and his legacy, as well as some of the key things that his party, the People's Action Party, has called for over the years?
So, Adam, as you said, I've mentioned Lee Kuan Yew, who was Singapore's founding prime minister and really the driving force behind the creation of modern Singapore. I'll just say a few words about him. He was Lee Kuan Yew was a member of Singapore's English-speaking Chinese elite. Came from a prosperous family, was educated at Cambridge, where he read law and was a brilliant student. There are a couple of things that I think are really worth knowing about him. One of them is that he was strongly influenced by the British historian Arnold Toynbee. So Toynbee, one of Toynbee's central ideas was to focus on how civilizations respond to challenges. And he argued that when they face unprecedented challenges, either from their environment or a political rival, civilizations successfully adapt or collapse. And those that survive do so because they're led in their response to this challenge by a creative minority, in Toynbee's words. So, and Lee often saw history, and particularly that part of history that he was engaged in post-colonial Singapore, as a kind of heroic struggle. And that was initially against the British, driving out the British as colonizers, and then against communism. So he led a push against the leading left-wing party of the day, and then against ethnic chauvinism, leading to the split with Malaya. And his ideas also had a racial element. He saw the native people of Southeast Asia as basically placid and happy-go-lucky, and thought that immigrants who came from China were more driven. And this was, I think, in some ways, stereotype that was adopted from European colonizers that he'd internalized. I would say that Lee ran the country in association with a small elite of also highly talented men. They were all men. The party was called the People's Action Party. Its symbol was a lightning flash. The men wore white shirts to symbolize their purity. But I don't think it was a party in the sense that many people would recognize a political party in the West. It wasn't one that really had a flourishing grassroots that drew from the bottom upwards. It was one that it was a party in which ideas and organization flowed really from the top down. In my view, the People's Action Party is essentially a vehicle for the rulers of Singapore, rather than a flourishing grassroots movement, as we might recognize a political party in the West.
So with Lee Kuan Yew, now that we've talked about a few of his characteristics and the People's Action Party, of course, one of the things that he's most recognized for internationally is setting Singapore on this path to being a global city, to being this clean, modern, economically advanced city. And you've touched on this a little bit, but it seems like so much of the Singaporean story, at least the perception of it internationally, is based around this sense of it being a modern, economically developed city. So what are some of the things that happened during Lee Kuan Yew's time in power that enabled Singapore to go from being a poor city to being the economic powerhouse that it has been over the last couple of decades?
Okay, so I would say there are probably three key elements to Lee Kuan Yew's rule and the governance of Singapore through the 60s and 70s, through that early post-colonial period that effectively laid the foundations for the modern country that we see, the first world country that we see now. And they are an emphasis on the core, I think, is an emphasis on clean and efficient government. So, as I've said earlier, zero tolerance of corruption, and an insistence on stamping out corruption, both petty and grand. The second part of that is spending on some key public services, so education, transport, infrastructure, and housing, all of which were significantly developed in Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew. So there's a free state school system, which is one of the best school systems in the world, public housing that puts a roof over everyone's head, a really efficient modern transport infrastructure, and a lot of connections to the outside world, Singapore Airlines, container port, that was built often in advance of the demand being there. And then I think the third key element of Singapore's modernization was a persistent emphasis on moving up the value chain. So moving from developing the semiconductor trade to developing petrochemicals to building a finance industry. So at each point, moving to a sector that needed more and more education, needed higher levels of skills, and where Singapore couldn't be outcompeted on price by its regional neighbors.
If you're interested in starting a website, then use Bluehost. I use Bluehost for placesandprofiles.com, and it's great. Their customer support is quick, responsive, and helpful, and it works well with WordPress, WooCommerce, Google Workspace, and countless other online tools. As an added bonus, if you get your domain name or hosting through my Bluehost link, then I will mention your website on the show and link to your website on placesandprofiles.com, as long as your website is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Bluehost and get your domain name and hosting today by going to placesandprofiles.com/blue. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/blue. Now, another key characteristic of Singapore, and we've touched on this a little bit, but it's the racial and linguistic and religious diversity of the country. You mentioned during your first answer of our conversation that you grew up in a Tamil-speaking household, and that was one of the reasons that you were drawn to Singapore, is because Tamil was an official language. Obviously, it's come up multiple times that English is an official language there. Malay is also an official language. Mandarin is also an official language. And as far as religion, Buddhism forms a plurality of Singaporeans in terms of religious identification, but nowhere close to a majority. So there's this melting pot, diverse nature of Singapore. You mentioned previously that there were race riots that broke out in 1964 that helped bring about Singaporean independence from Malaysia. But this notion of diversity and Singapore as a multiracial, multicultural, multilinguistic city and country has continued into the present day. So how has this diverse, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multilinguistic nature of Singapore, how has that shaped the country since it has been an independent country? And in what ways, if any, has that affected the economic development of Singapore?
So I think you're right to say that Singapore is, in ethnic and religious terms, incredibly heterogeneous. I think, however, it's worth noting that there's a substantial ethnic Chinese majority. So ethnic Chinese account for 3/4 of the population in Singapore. So that is, I would say, the predominant influence. And if you look at the elite in Singapore, the government is entirely, but not exclusively, made up of people from the ethnic Chinese community. In terms of how the racial mix in Singapore has shaped it, I would say there's a clear consciousness in Singapore. There's a clear consciousness at the government level in Singapore of the need to carefully manage racial differences. So there are quotas for ethnicities in every public housing block to make sure, and in every neighborhood, to make sure that racial ghettos don't emerge in Singapore. I mean, there's still to some extent a degree of clustering in certain areas. There's a part of town called Little India, which is particularly Tamil. There's a Chinatown, for example, and there's a traditionally Malay part of town. But it's certainly a very mixed city. As there's an emphasis in Singapore's education system of recognizing diversity, but also emphasizing a collective Singaporean identity and a sense of Singapore as a homeland. The extent to which Singapore's racial mix has affected its economic development has, I think, been relatively minor, with perhaps one important exception that's slowly kind of growing in importance. Singapore has traded on a number of important qualities economically, none of which are really to do with race. So it's traded on the fact that it speaks English. It's made a great deal of having a clean government and an efficient government, of having slick infrastructure, having a very hard-working population. So those things aren't really to do with its racial mix. And Singapore has traditionally, I would say, in geopolitical terms, been closer to the US than to any other country. I mean, it is an independent country and one that's very assertive of the rights of small nations. But in terms of its defense ties, its economic ties, those have always been very strong with the US. I think the interesting shift in Singapore that's emerging now is a growing connection with China, There's obviously a strong economic connection with China. There's significant Singaporean investment in mainland China. A number of people from a number of Chinese mainlanders have moved to Singapore and made it their home. So there's a strong connection between the two countries. At a time when China and the US are strategic competitors, that obviously puts Singapore in a position of a degree of tension. And that, I think, is an interesting place for Singapore to be, in a slightly uncomfortable place. But it's a place that has always been led by a fairly westernized elite, but has also had a pretty strong Chinese identity. So always had the pull of both those parts of the world.
All right, now I want to shift gears a little bit and return to a topic that you made brief reference to earlier, and that's this tension in Singapore between sort of modernity and development on the one hand, but not being able to speak out against the government and certain elements of what we could call authoritarianism on the other hand. Now, I've seen Singapore described before as Disneyland with the death penalty. Where does that nickname come from? And can you talk a little more about this sort of tension that has existed in Singapore over the last couple of decades?
So Disneyland with the death penalty is William Gibson's famous description of Singapore. And it's a very apt one. I think there is a feel when you're in Singapore that it's a material paradise, that all your wants are taken care of. There are vast air-conditioned malls in which you can buy absolutely anything your heart desires. There's the economy tends to be pretty buoyant. People have jobs. People have money to spend. They enjoy going out. So you can have a very pleasant life in Singapore, albeit there is significant inequality there too. And then there is the slightly darker side of Singapore, which is that the ruling elite has always been very stern about criticism, very quick to smack down their critics, occasionally pursuing opposition politicians and foreign media with libel actions, which they have generally won, occasionally pursuing opposition politicians and foreign media with libel actions, which they have won, and also emphasizing a pretty tight relationship between the state and the media, which has ensured for years that Singaporeans have an information environment which tends to be very pro-government. So there's a strange combination of a place that's basically a capitalist paradise, but one which also feels pretty tightly circumscribed, and one that also feels pretty tightly circumscribed in terms of what you might be able to say about those in power.
Yeah, you mentioned there libel action being taken against foreign media members and opposition politicians. So what are some of the things that have been said or could be said to bring about libel action against people that are speaking out against the government?
What I would say is that anything that tends to question the propriety of the ruling elite, the kind of thing that might get shrugged off in a rowdier democracy, can attract a libel suit in Singapore. And particularly any suggestion that members of the Lee family have gained some kind of undue advantage through nepotism, that tends to be a very, very sensitive point.
Okay, and another area where Singapore's government has been greatly involved in this, in some ways maybe a trivial matter, but it's one of the more, one of the better known characteristics of the Singaporean government internationally, and that's this infamous chewing gum law. So, what exactly is that chewing gum law? What's the purpose of that?
So, the original motivation behind the ban on the sale of chewing gum was that it would gum up the MRT, which is the Singaporean metro. There was a fear that it would gum up the doors of the metro. From the best of my recollection, I think that I'm not sure that ban is still in place. I think you can buy gum in Singapore now. I mean, there is a pretty strict ban on eating or drinking on the metro, so you can't cause any spills there. But what I think is amusing about this ban is that it's perhaps the best known fact about Singapore. It's the one fact that's traveled all around the world. And I think in some ways it's quite emblematic of the place as a place that pays attention to small details that might impede the efficiency of the system, even in ways that might seem absurd to observers from other countries.
Now, you made reference to the Singapore MRT subway system, and when I was in Singapore 6.5 years ago in 2017, certainly the MRT, Singapore Changi Airport, which is one of the better known features of Singapore. Both of them are very modern, very clean. They have all sorts of green spaces and parks and tourist attractions that all have this very clean, modern feel to them. So you've touched on this a little bit, but this focus on cleanliness and modernity in Singapore, what are some other places where we might see this in terms of infrastructure or in terms of things that are visible to the eye by someone visiting Singapore?
That's certainly the first impression that you have of Singapore. So from Changi Airport to the metro to the hotel that you arrive at, but it's the case in shopping malls and really, really kind of in every sort of public space in Singapore, that things will be very manicured, things will be very pristine in terms of their hygiene and their presentation. I should say in terms of kind of Singapore's history, it was obviously a tropical island. It was one that was covered in rainforest. So its modern appearance, both the malls, but also the kind of green spaces and the grass, are all to some extent artificial. So there is a sort of theme park quality in a way to how this sultry tropical Asian island has been transformed into a kind of air-conditioned bubble. And there is something of a shift now in Singapore away from the kind of urban planning that focused heavily on air conditioning and focused heavily on straightening out kinks, and a shift back towards having canals that are winding like rivers, and developing gardens that feature more tropical plants and adding more foliage, basically, and attempting to recover some of Singapore's tropical past.
Maybe 3 more questions before we wrap up. And the next place I want to turn is, the title of your book is called Lion City. That's a nickname that's attached to Singapore. There's also this imagery, this figure of the merlion that is prominent in Singapore, prominent statue in downtown Singapore, a smaller version on the island of Sentosa. Both of those statues are things that I saw when I was there 6.5 years ago. But where does this lion city nickname come from for Singapore, and this imagery of the merlion? Where does all of that come from?
So, Lion City, the title of my book, is literally what Singapore means in Sanskrit, Singapura, and it's one of the old names for the island. And the Singapore's mascot, the merlion, which is obviously a famous kind of Instagram attraction now, was something that was basically invented as a tourist mascot in the 1960s.
Okay, so we talked about Lee Kuan Yew earlier. He's been deceased for a while, but his son, Lee Hsien Loong, is the current prime minister of Singapore, and he's been prime minister going back to 2004. So what are some of the characteristics of his time as prime minister of Singapore, and how could we describe his legacy as compared to his father's legacy?
So I'd say there are relatively few leaders in history who can really match Lee Kuan Yew's achievement of really propelling a country from a developing post-colonial state into really the very front rank of the industrialized world. I'd say his son's record in office is a bit more patchy. So voters have been pretty critical during his time of overcrowding on public transport, of a big rise in immigration to Singapore. He's provided, Lee Hsien Loong, I would say, has provided stability through the pandemic. Lee Hsien Loong was due to retire by 2022, but put this off when the pandemic broke out. And his finance minister, Lawrence Wong, is expected to succeed him at the time of the next election.
All right. So before we wrap up, I mentioned during the introduction of the show that we'd be talking some of the issues and challenges faced by modern Singapore, that would be one of the things that we would look at today. You've touched on some of this a little bit, but as Singapore moves potentially into the post-Lee Hsien Loong era, and as it continues to strive for being this clean, efficient, modern, economically developed country, what are some of the main issues and challenges that you anticipate Singapore facing in the coming years?
The two most obvious challenges to Singapore, I would say, are firstly demography. It's aging very rapidly. And secondly, climate. So it's a low-lying island at a time when there's a risk of a shift in the weather, particularly in maritime Asia, making parts of the region much less habitable than they have been in the past. And I think one other challenge that I'd identify is perhaps a bit less tangible, and that is that Singapore can sometimes lack a sense of fun and lack a sense of creativity. And it can sometimes feel, particularly amongst the next generation of leaders in Singapore, that they're a bit less agile than the first post-colonial generation in their mentality.
All right. Well, Jeevan, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Singapore is obviously a very fascinating country with a lot of tensions, a lot of seeming contradictions, a lot of diversity, but very modern, very developed. Is there anything that we haven't touched on related to Singapore that, given your experiences of living in Singapore, given your experiences of writing the book, that you think is essential for someone trying to understand Singapore?
I think the one kind of point that we haven't discussed at length is the fact that Singapore is very small. So if you look at the trend, the political trend, it has been one in which large states pretty much dominate the world. So you have the US and China as the kind of two great powers. The European Union, where countries are pooling sovereignty and resources. But Singapore offers an alternative model, a city-state that's sort of thriving in an era when city-states are meant to be a thing of the past. And I think Singapore shows that small countries, while they're vulnerable to external shocks, can also benefit from the rapid spread of technology, can benefit from the lowering of trade barriers, and can continue to be viable political models even in a world that's dominated by very large powers.
All right. Well, Jeevan, again, thank you so much for joining me today. I mentioned this some in the introduction when I went over your bio, but can you briefly go back over any resources or works of yours that you would recommend listeners take a look at?
Well, I'd love you to read my book, Lion City, Singapore and the Invention of Modern Asia, which is published by Pegasus in the US.
All right. Well, again, the book we've been talking about is Lion City, Singapore, and the Invention of Modern Asia. And by going to the show notes page for today's episode, placesandprofiles.com/11, you can find a link to that. You can find more information pertaining to today's episode, more information about Jeevan, who, as we mentioned earlier, is climate editor at Tortoise Media, and again, author of Lion City, Singapore, and the Invention of Modern Asia. So the place to go for resources and links related to Jeevan's work and related to today's episode about Singapore is placesandprofiles.com/11, placesandprofiles.com/11. And Jeevan, I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time today and for coming on the show to take a look at Singapore. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for your excellent questions, Adam.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.